So your reading assignment for this week was chapter 7 in the textbook, and that chapter is on autonomy. I'm going to go over the basic points in the chapter and try to connect some of those points to the videos that you watched, to our situation in quarantine today, and the topic for this class broadly, which has a lot to do with technology. So how technology might affect autonomy. So hopefully I can do all that while going over the main points of the text. So first, let's define autonomy. So autonomy is just self-governance, the ability to make rules for ourselves and follow them. So generally, it's the absence of external constraints, although as we'll see, autonomy doesn't require the complete absence of restraints. You can have autonomy within sort of bounded autonomy. So a decision is autonomous if it is, 1, intentional, 2, made with sufficient understanding of possible actions and the consequences of those actions, and 3, free from controlling, constraining influences. That's not to say free from causes, just free from constraints. So when the questions that will come up in this chapter: when, if ever, should we limit the choices of consumers to buy products and companies to sell them, especially if both parties agree? Are there any circumstances where we should limit the autonomy of consumers and companies to sell products? When, if ever, should employers limit the choices of employees? And when, if ever, should we limit the choices of employers? So a working assumption of a free market economy is, it's built into free market, right? So that we should, that autonomy is a virtue, and only under very extreme circumstances should we limit it. But when might we be justified to limit autonomy, and when might we not? Before we get into answering those questions, we're going to talk a little bit more about the definition of autonomy. So the criteria that a decision would have to meet to be autonomous. So those 3: intention, that the decision is intentional, that it's made with sufficient understanding, and that it's free from controlling influences, in other words, voluntary. So let's jump into those. So first, intentionality. To act intentionally means that we frame a plan and purposefully put that plan into action. So we think about our possible actions. We imagine what the consequences are going to be. We want to achieve some goal, so we put a plan into action to try to achieve that goal. Intentional actions are distinguished between themselves and accidents. So when I just coughed, or if I sneeze because allergies are killing me this spring, those would be accidents. Those would be things that I weren't responsible. If I were driving and a sneeze caused me to veer off the road, and there was whatever dash cam footage that showed that that was the case, then that would not be something that I was responsible for. That would not be an action that I performed autonomously. That would just be something that happened to me. Intentional actions, on the other hand, are those that we plan to undertake and do with some awareness of the consequences. And if we meet those conditions and we're not externally constrained, then we're autonomously do them and we're responsible for the consequences. Now, a complicating factor here is our motivations are complex and often opaque, meaning The actions of others, they can tell us what's motivating them, but we can never be quite sure. And similarly with ourselves, ever since Freud and even before him, I mean, all the way back to Kant, Kant worried about this problem that on the surface, the actions of a saint and a complete hypocrite um, can be equivalent. So somebody might give to charity because they're genuinely concerned with other people's well-being. Somebody might give to charity because they have a nefarious plan to increase their reputation, to get power for selfish ends. So another issue here is that we often rationalize why we do things in hindsight. So, and we often do it in such a way that we make ourselves look better, right? So you perform some action, somebody calls you out for it, and then you say, well, what I was trying to do was this good thing. Even my 2-year-old son is already engaged in that. I'll say, why are you doing it? He'll say, I'm just trying to help the animal or whatever. But normally did something slightly malicious. So why is this a problem for autonomy? It's a problem because it seems to act intentionally. We need to have tried to do something, but then there are also consequences of our actions that we sometimes do not intend. So people will often try to say that they didn't do something intentionally because it was an unforeseen consequence, but it could be that they were trying to bring about that consequence. So if we don't know if an action was undertaken intentionally, or if somebody didn't have an intention to perform an action, they might say it was an accident instead of intentional, then it makes it difficult to decide if they did it autonomously, if they're responsible for their action. So instead of trying to discern what really motivates people, philosophers have tried to solve this problem by talking about the idea of authenticity. And they use that to determine the extent to which an action is intentional. So the way you determine if an action is authentic is you talk about a person's lifelong patterns of behavior. So the closer an action is to lifelong patterns of behavior and stated life goals, the more authentic an action is, and therefore the more autonomous. Now, note this sort of sidesteps the issue of what's actually motivating the action. So instead of like an internalist way of figuring out if an action is intentional, instead it looks at more objective features from the outside, so an externalist idea here. So does this action fit a pattern of acting that some agent has? And if so, then we say it's an authentic action and autonomous. If not, if it's very out of the ordinary for somebody, though that happens, though it sometimes happens that we try to perform an action that's out of the ordinary or out of character, more often those types of actions would be accident or an accident, non-intentional. All right, so that's one criteria. An action has to be intentional in order to be autonomous. Another criteria is understanding. So full information is assumed in free markets, that that consumers are aware of what it is that they're purchasing, possible consequences of the things that they purchase, that companies are aware of whatever government regulations there are and how they can comply with them. But there's an issue here, and that's full information can be overwhelming to consumers. Sometimes producers withhold information, and being presented with information is not the same as understanding it. So, I mean, you may have experienced this when you go to the grocery store. You're deciding between very similar looking products, um, and there's all kind of things you should take. I mean, one bag of chips is cheaper than the other bag of chips, but if you look closely, you'll see that even though they look like they're the same size, one bag of chips contains more ounces than the other. You'll see things like you'll see misleading claims of producers. So you'll see things that are labeled as fat-free, like oil that you might spray on a pan is often labeled fat-free, but that's just because it falls below a certain serving size threshold. So sometimes producers withhold. That's an example of them withholding information. And another interesting thing that the book points out here is being presented with information is not the same as understanding it. So the example it gives is of smoking. So in the case of smoking, there are warning labels. There are required to be warning labels on packages of cigarettes now, talking about the risks of cancer. But do people understand that in a concrete way? The text makes the case that probably not. Like if you actually take people who are thinking about smoking to a cancer ward of a hospital, and you saw people dying of lung cancer, if understanding of full information is required, then maybe we should do something like that. That people should apply to get smoking license in the same way that they apply to get driver's license. So you would have to demonstrate that you understand the information that these warning labels are giving you, not just that the information comes in front of your comes into your view, right? Other examples the text gives are so some drugs, fen-phen, ephedra. I'll let you look at those for yourself. Suffice it to say that sufficient testing of these products is not always done before they're brought to market, and they can lead to side effects that people, if they were fully aware of the side effects and the likelihood of those side effects, they would probably not be taking those drugs. The other case that I want to talk about throughout this video is the McDonald's coffee case. So hopefully you watched that video. Growing up, I always thought about that case as an example of a frivolous lawsuit where somebody was just trying to get rich. I didn't know the details of it, that McDonald's was serving their coffee at 190 degrees, close to boiling, and that many people received horrific injuries from it, and that the woman who spilled her coffee on herself had third-degree burns and had to have a skin graft, and oh man, it seems horrific. Now, was she aware that she was getting hot coffee? Yes. Did she fully understand that if she spilled that cup of coffee that she could get third-degree burns and requiring skin grafts? Probably not. So it makes sense that she would ask for some help with the medical costs, that it was not entirely her fault that she received those burns and needed those skin grafts. So McDonald's should be arguably partly liable for those damages. So was she aware that she was purchasing a hot coffee? Yes. Was she aware how hot that would be, and that coffee that hot can do that kind of damage? Not clear that that met the full information or full understanding requirement. If full understanding of the information is required, not just that it's put in front of somebody, but that they understand the information as well. Then we need to address many questions about the reasoning and maturity of a population. So this, especially, we'll talk about kids later, marketing to children, and making them understand. That would take significant resources. And maybe we should require that companies undertake the project of making their consumers fully understand the potential consequences of purchasing their products. All right, so the final condition. So we've talked about intentionality, understanding, and now voluntariness. So voluntariness, again, just being that when somebody acts, they're free from constraining influence. So that can happen in a number of ways. Our autonomy is threatened by external pressures and threats. So things like national borders make it so that we can't travel freely between places. Realities of the job market that favors employers and at the disadvantage, and is a disadvantage to employees. So while somebody could say, well, look, yeah, people get low pay at work. They can just not accept that job and they could try to look for a different job. Well, those other jobs probably require all sorts of qualifications. Sometimes even entry-level positions require already to be having worked in the field, etc. So these threats actually limit an employee's autonomy, their ability to say, actually, I don't want this job anymore. I want to get a different job. If the job market is such that employers have the advantage over employees, then the employee's autonomy is threatened. Also consider the fact that if an employee leaves a job, then a future employer will probably look at that as a mark against them, especially if they've done it frequently. Whereas especially in this country, since workers aren't very well organized, they don't have the same sort of power. They don't enjoy that same sort of threat advantage versus employers. So I think we only have 10%. Only 10% of workers in the United States are parts of unions, and without that sort of organization, employees don't have much say. So, internal threats. So those are some external threats to autonomy. Then there are internal threats to autonomy, and these are psychological influences. So, coercion is sort of a combination, can be a combination of an external threat and an internal threat. So somebody convinces you that if you don't do what they tell you to do, that you'll face consequences that are worse than if you do it. That would be a constraining threat that would limit your autonomy. So limit your voluntariness and thereby limit your autonomy and thereby limit your moral responsibility for those sorts of things. So somebody holds a gun to your head and tells you to steal a candy bar. If you do it, we're not going to hold you accountable for stealing the candy bar. In the job market, an employer might coerce you to do something by threatening to fire you. And when there aren't other good paying jobs available, then that can limit an employee's autonomy. The next is manipulation can be a threat, internal threat to autonomy. So I posted that Darren Brown video as an example of this. The advertising, the marketers were manipulated to come up with something that they thought they were coming up with themselves. So to what extent did they come up with that those drawings autonomously with that slogan, autonomously. In what sense was it voluntary? It seems it wasn't very voluntary. It was actually manipulated by somebody outside, somebody working behind the scenes to make them come up with it. So we might worry about that in terms of with regard to how voluntary our actions are. How much are we manipulated by subconscious forces? And finally, persuasion. Persuasion itself doesn't threaten autonomy. So somebody presents reasons for taking a certain course of action. That by itself is not a threat to autonomy because we can evaluate those reasons. But often when somebody's trying to persuade, they're sneaking in elements of coercion or manipulation. So somebody's trying to persuade you to do something. They mention that bad consequences might happen if you don't, so subtle coercion. Or they're trying to press your buttons in the right sort of way to manipulate you into doing something. When I went to jury duty, and actually got to the courtroom for the jury when they decide who's going to be on the jury and who's not. That process, I was amazed to see how much the lawyers were including language in their arguments that was, to me, very clearly manipulative, and not just statements of the facts, but framing of the facts. So we have to worry when somebody's trying to persuade us. If you've ever gone to buy a car, the salesmen are often trying to manipulate you. I remember when I was trying to buy a car, I was trying to buy a Prius, and the salesman said, "Oh, what did you say you do?" And I said, "Oh, I teach philosophy." And he said, "Oh, that's funny. A philosopher just came in here last week and bought the same make and model of this car." And I thought, oh, that's an interesting attempt to manipulate me into buying this, but what does that have to do with my purchase, right? I didn't say that out loud, but I was thinking it, and I didn't buy that car. Now, an issue here is we often overestimate the control we have over our actions, and oftentimes there have been many studies done on this, that we explain our actions as if we voluntarily perform them, even in cases where we didn't. So again, that Darren Brown video, look at what the advertisers, the process that they say they went to produce their ad, to produce their logo and slogan. They said, "Oh, we thought about this, but that seemed a little bit too twee," I think they said. And then we went to this option. And then we thought so-and-so. When really, what was the explanation for how they arrived at that particular logo and that slogan? That they had seen it and subconsciously registered it on their way to the meeting. So we often overestimate the control we have over our actions. So our actions are rarely as voluntary as we think that they are. You'll hear people championing autonomy and voluntariness and free will and responsibility. But when we start looking at the details of how our actions are performed, the various studies that have been done in the psychological literature, it should shake our faith that our actions are sufficiently voluntary to be autonomous, and sufficiently autonomous to be responsible. So that leaves us with some worries about the relationships that consumers and that companies should have with their consumers, and that companies should have with their employees. All right, so let's talk about when it might be morally justified to limit autonomy. One case here is benign paternalism. So paternalism, when somebody performs a paternalistic act, usually we think that's a bad thing. So we talked about this when we talked about deontology. Remember that Immanuel Kant had the view that had proposed something called the principle of humanity, that we should never use other people as means to, as mere means, without respecting the fact that they have their own wills that they can direct however they wish. Now, a paternalistic act would be, say, you know your roommate has big tests to study for, so you decide without asking them before they come home from work that you're going to remove the TV from their room and hide it so that they're not distracted, so that they have to take their test. Well, that's a severe attack on their autonomy. But you could say, well, look, that's benign. This is a case of benign paternalism. Paternalism meaning, looking after you like a father would a son, and benign being beneficial, right? So I'm looking after you. It's true I'm limiting your autonomy, but it's for your own benefit. Now, in that case, probably unjustified. Your roommate would have very good grounds to complain that you're doing something morally wrong. But in other cases, it's not so clear. Maybe it would be morally justified. You see this in sports contracts sometimes, that they'll have clauses that that the people signing those contracts shouldn't be riding motorcycles because that leads to high injury and death rates. And that could possibly be justified. I mean, the person hopefully is fully aware of what they're signing to when they're signing the contract, but it is a bit of a paternalistic stance that the company is taking to their to the athlete in that case. They're telling them, look, this is for your own good. I mean, it's for our good primarily, but this is also for your own good, that you not do things like go parasailing or ride motorcycles. We're dealing with cases where the government is making decisions that they are justifying on the grounds that it's true they're being paternalistic, but it's for our own benefit, right? So with the outbreak of a pandemic, there's harm that could spread. And even if somebody's young and healthy, it might not harm them if they go out into the world, but if they contract this disease and they spread it to others, then that will be bad for everyone. So they might justify the restrictions they're putting on our autonomy, and make no mistake about it, they are putting restrictions on our autonomy, but it might be justified because it might be for our own benefit. Now let's talk about the prevention of harm. So you might limit somebody's authority. You might limit somebody's autonomy to prevent harm from coming to you, right? So John Stuart Mill thought that prevention of harm was the only justified circumstance in which we could limit somebody's autonomy. And that only was the case if we didn't have time to make a person aware of the harm that might befall them. So this is harm that might befall them. So he gives the analogy of somebody who's about to walk across a very dangerous bridge. And if we didn't have time to warn them, we might be justified in just jumping in front of them and limiting their autonomy so that we could explain the circumstance to them. But after we had explained the circumstance to them, if they said, okay, I'm fully aware of the dangers that might befall me if I cross this bridge, and I'm still going to cross it, then Mill wants to say we are not justified in placing limits on that person's autonomy. But there are some issues here, and I'm going to, let's talk about consumer competence. So are people really aware of the harms that might befall them? Are they skilled enough to avoid those harms? These are issues we would have to consider. And a point that brings me back to that benign paternalism issue, the harm harms are rarely constrained to individuals. So the person crossing that bridge, are they do they have a family? Or do they support that family? If so, then might we want to put some constraints on their autonomy because of their relationship with other people, that the harm that will befall them will affect the others. Similarly, somebody might say in this current crisis that, well, look, I'm just going outside to surf, man. Like, if I want to take that risk, that's perfectly permissible. I'm risking harm to myself, but I'm fully aware of the risk and I'm taking that. Somebody might be justified in saying, well, look, you're thinking about going outside, you're thinking about risking being infected, and it's true that you may be fully aware of what might happen to you, but have you considered that if you get it, then you might become a new vector for this disease spreading, and that other people might die? So the prevention of harm analogy from Mill is nice and instructive, but we do have to look at some caveats to that harm often spreads beyond individuals. Another way that people attempt to justify limits on autonomy is by upholding moral standards. So not allowing people to work as prostitutes, and not allowing the sale of pornography. So the view here is that we should be living up to certain moral standards, even if everybody's in agreement. So even if the prostitute is in agreement that they're selling that service, and the consumer is in full agreement, they know what they're purchasing, even in that case, somebody might say that it's justified to limit the autonomy of the seller and the consumer based on the moral standards of the community. Now, in opposition to this, somebody might invoke the idea of market morality, that if we really thought that was immoral, then there wouldn't be a market for it, but there is a market for it, and we should allow the market to be free and to freely determine what is permissible and what's impermissible. But we've seen some problems with that idea too. So there are arguments on both sides of this issue. So another idea that we should talk about is the idea of buyer beware. So businesses often appeal to the idea of caveat emptor to defend themselves, that the ultimate responsibility for purchasing a product lies with the consumer. But something we should note is that that responsibility is not unconditional. So the seller must make an attempt not to deceive the customer, or attempt again to give full information and understanding of full information to the customer. The buyer must be in the right state of mind in order to be responsible for their actions. Again, we could talk about the McDonald's coffee case here, in that the woman knew she was purchasing a hot coffee and it might cause some damage if she spilled it, but did she know it would cause third-degree burns and a $20,000 hospital trip? Not so clear. So advertising, we've talked about it already, but we should touch on it again. There are different types of advertising: informative versus persuasive advertising. So informative just provides the information. Persuasive attempts to get you to make a certain decision. The lines between these are a little bit blurry, although they're clear-cut cases of each. Marketers, the text points out a nice thing here. Marketers have sort of a dual job. They seek to create or amplify desires, and then show that their product or service is the best way to fulfill that desire. Text makes a nice distinction between persuasive advertising and puffery. I'm not going to get into that now. Let's talk about the moral issues. certain products are marketed to exploitable populations. So populations that where education is rare, or there are low levels of education in that population, um, or that population is not fully rational. So in the case of kids, there's a lot of market. My son watches a lot of YouTube videos now, and they're already marketing all sorts of products to him. Thankfully, he's too young to recognize that he can get something, that he can like pester us about it enough, and that we get that product for him. But it's sort of sinister, the way they market these products to kids. They're an exploitable population. They don't know what's good for them. They're not fully aware of all the consequences of purchasing products and engaging with those products. So the ethics of that is questionable. Then there's the ethics of addictive products. So the marketing of especially substances that are addictive to populations that might not be fully aware of the effects of addiction. Again, if full understanding is a requirement for a free market, then maybe we should require that companies that are trying to sell addictive products should show cases of addiction, should talk about those side effects, not just like they're abstract, but show concrete cases of what addiction might look like. I have also run into this where I know some people who are like not very financially secure, and they consider taking out loans, short-term loans with very high interest rates. And the people who give those loans are preying on people who need them, or people who might want them and aren't aware of the alternatives, aren't able to process how the different loan rates and stuff like that. It's sad to see, and there seems to be something immoral going on there. All right, so finally, let's talk about autonomy in the workplace. So contractual employment, the very nature of it, restricts autonomy. Moral issues arise if an employee is forced to give up legal activities that have no bearing on their performance. So we might wonder, should employers be able to do things like drug tests, right? If we decide as a country, or certain places in this country, marijuana is legalized for personal use, should an employer be able to force their employees to take drug tests with the threat that they'll be fired if they don't, and if they test positive for having used a substance like marijuana, should they be allowed to fire their employee? Now, employers are allowed to discriminate on the basis of drug testing and psychometric assessment. Employers try to justify that in a number of ways. The first is productivity. So there have been studies done in people who do use or abuse, the line there is very fine, substances are on average less productive than those who don't. There's a legality claim. If the person is consuming illegal substances, that the company should play a role in upholding the laws of the land. And then there's a morality claim that companies should play a role in making sure that the moral standards of the community are upheld by trying to make sure that their employees are not engaged in illegal activities. How justified that is an interesting question. Should we take a hands-off approach to that, or should companies be engaged in that sort of autonomy limiting activity? Employers ought not discriminate on factors that are irrelevant to job performance. There are some exceptions to that. A possible exception, in some cases, employers hire based on customer preferences. The text gives the example of women sometimes preferring that their gynecologist be a woman. So if a university, say, went out of their way to hire a woman for the job, would that be acceptable? Maybe. The other issue we should talk about here is employment at will. And this is shocking to read, that 90% of employees in the United States are employed at will, which means that the company can terminate them for any reason or no reason at all. In fact, in the United States, there is no law, no federal restriction from firing people because of, let me make sure I'm getting the list right here. So there's no federal law prohibiting an employer from firing somebody on the basis of sexual preference, obesity, or political allegiance. I found that all shocking. I thought we had gotten beyond that, but apparently not. So there's no federal restriction against that. And 90% of Americans are employed at will, meaning they can quit for any reason or no reason whatsoever, and the employer can fire them for any reason or for no reason whatsoever. That is... Now you might think, well, both sides are autonomous then. Both are coming to the marketplace and can freely offer their services and freely take them away. Sounds great, but again, employers have the significant threat advantage over the employees. So there's that issue to contend with again. Finally, we'll talk about whistleblowing, and then we'll get on to the quiz questions. So if we think back to Mill's bridge analogy, imagine that somebody walked onto the bridge without realizing it was dangerous. And once they were on the bridge, they realized how dangerous it was, and people were trying to come onto the bridge behind them. We would think that the person on the bridge would be morally obligated to sound the alarm, to let the others know that this was a dangerous bridge, that they also shouldn't walk on it. And for similar reasons, we might say people have a moral obligation to engage in whistleblowing, to announce when things are not going as people think they are, inside companies, inside government agencies. And we should try to protect whistleblowers because there's a lot at stake, often the person's job. We see that in the government right now. If somebody alerts the press or the outside world that things are not going as they should within the government, sometimes they're removed from their position. And this happens in corporations as well. We've seen the text brings up the case of high-ranking managers at Enron selling their stock before the public found out that the company was going down, and they were trying to keep it a secret that the company was going down. We see this in the government recently. Before the outbreak of the virus, there were some government officials who were notified that this was coming and how bad it was likely to be, and so they sold their stock before the market crashed without alerting their constituents what they had just heard. All bad news. But people should be made aware of the dangers that could befall them. So how does autonomy relate to the issue of technology? It certainly relates if we're talking about artificial intelligence and what roles artificial intelligence might play. When we talked about the use of robots in war in the final chapter of Living with Robots, the authors made a convincing case that the more artificial intelligence was relied on, the less autonomy the less autonomy people would have to make decisions about the life and death of other people. So generals would be already are apparently, and we'll see it happen more often, that generals will be made aware of what the likely outcome of their decisions would be by artificial intelligences, and their decisions would be constrained in a way, because to go against the recommendation of the artificial intelligence would take a significant justification. So artificial intelligence and autonomy, that might be something interesting to explore if you're writing about that topic. You would want to talk about what autonomy means, what conditions, decisions, and actions need to meet to be made autonomously, and how new technology might threaten those conditions. That would be an interesting piece to your final paper. All right, so now let's get to the quiz questions. So quiz question number 1, autonomy means A, limitless freedom, B, self-governance, or C, the ability to persuade. Quiz question number 2, according to Mill, remember he's the one who gave the bridge analogy, what is the only justifiable reason for interfering with another's liberty? A, self-protection, in other words, preventing harm from befalling them, but only temporarily. B, benign paternalism, or C, enforcing the moral standards of the community. Which of these does Mill think is the only justifiable reason for interfering with another's liberty? All right, thanks for sticking with me. I'll see you next time for our final lecture of this class. Thanks. Hope you're all doing well.